starting with a study of William Shakespeare on page 1171 in your text. I'm not going to go over a lot of the terms that show up that are in both italics and boldface. But do make sure you're familiar with them. As an example, on 1174, there are 3 different kinds of English plays that are italicized. You need to be familiar with those. And then obviously the bold-faced terms you do also. But just to get a little bit of background to Shakespeare before we jump into A Midsummer Night's Dream. I don't know how far we'll get today. I know we have 3 or 4 days set aside for Midsummer Night's Dream. Start with Shakespeare himself. We know exactly when he died, April 23rd, 1616. His birth date, we're not 100% sure. Most scholars give the date April 23rd, 1564 for his birthday. That's for a couple of reasons. One, because he dies on that day in 1616, so it's a nice balance or parallel. If I remember correctly, we do have his baptismal certificate, and according to English custom at the time, you can calculate, if you don't have a birth certificate, date of birth based on the baptismal certificate. It's like 3 days or 8 days, usually after birth, and that's another reason. A third reason, which is entirely just symbolic, okay? April 23rd is the feast day in the Christian church of St. George, the great martyr. St. George is the patron saint of England. The red cross that you'll see in a lot of English flags, the Union Jack, which has the main cross in the middle, and then it's got 2 bars that go out on either side. That's the St. George cross, okay? So, patronal feast day for the Saint of England, to have Shakespeare born and dying on that. Symbolically, it's got a nice ring to it because he's the greatest writer in the English language, all that kind of stuff. Notice, by the way, when he dies, he's only 52, okay? And he's writing all of his plays, for the most part, we think, from around 1589 or 1590 to 1612. It's about 22 years. So in that 22-year period, he writes 37 full-length plays, 4 very long poems, several hundred lines each, and 154 14-line sonnets. It's a lot to cram into 22 years. I mean, just leave the 4 poems and the sonnets aside. 37 plays in 22 years comes out to just about 1.5 plays per year. 1 3/4 maybe, okay? And these aren't little short plays like you have in your book, like trifles, which is 4 pages. Takes 20 minutes or so. The shortest of Shakespeare's plays, one of the comedies, I can't remember which one, Comedy of Errors, maybe, takes about 3 hours. If you fully produce it, that is, you don't skip any lines. Hamlet's over 4 hours, all right? And he writes about 1.5 of these a year. And some of the years during that period, he's writing a lot more. I mean, we know some years he's writing 3 or 4 plays, okay? Just cranking them out there. Born into middle-class family, Warwickshire. His father began as a glover, that is, he made gloves, imported, also was an importer. He rose up socially in Stratford, his father did, eventually became mayor, held the position of mayor for a couple of times, and then after Shakespeare moves away from home, his fortunes kind of fall, okay? And he doesn't end up poor, but he's not nearly as well off as he was. In 1582, and I'm pretty sure this is November, of 1582, Shakespeare marries Anne Hathaway. Anne Hathaway comes from an old family nearby. Shakespeare comes from old families. His mother's name was Mary Arden, okay? You can go to Mary Arden's house just outside Stratford today. You can go to Anne Hathaway's house just outside Stratford. There's a forest nearby Stratford named Arden Forest, named after the Ardens. We're going to see an Arden at one of his plays, As You Like It. A forest named Arden figures very prominently as one of the settings. Okay, so he marries Anne Hathaway. Shakespeare's 18 when he marries her. She's 26. To be 26 and unmarried in the 1580s, she was 50 years ago, she would have been called an old spinster at 26, okay, because she hadn't been married. Daughter Susanna was born in May of 1583. Do the math. She was about 3 months pregnant when they got married. Okay, they were not married in the local church in Stratford. We know that because there's no record of it, and marriage records are pretty good. It's thought that they were probably married about 2 counties over. I did not say this to my other 2 classes. I need to mention it. In Shakespeare's day, when a couple were getting married, the church practice was for the church where they would be married, because if you were married at a church, there wasn't no justice of the peace kind of stuff. When you got married, the custom was for the priest, rector, whatever, of the church to read or announce what are called the banns, okay? And they did this every Sunday for 3 consecutive Sundays before the marriage. So if you're getting married on April 28th, then on April 21st, April 14th, and April 7th, these banns would be pronounced. And the banns were essentially a line that gets brought into MIDI versions of a Christian wedding. If anyone knows any reason why X and Y should not be married, let him or her now forever speak or forever hold your peace. Usually the only reason someone would give for a couple not to be married is if some guy would say, I know, she's not a virgin anymore. And that would be cause, right immediately, for not having the wedding. Okay? These weren't read anywhere in Stratford or in Warwickshire. We know that, right? So Shakespeare probably slipped some priests some money in another county, and they got the wedding performed. So, eldest child Susanna, born in May of 1583, about 20 months later, I think it is February of 85, the twins, Hamnet and Judith, are born. All right? Hamnet dies sometime between, I'm not being able to get it from memory. Hamnet dies sometime between 1599 and 1601. I'm pretty sure it's 1599 and Shakespeare's father dies in 1601. He dies in his early teens, in other words. Okay? It's about that time that Shakespeare kind of, his writing takes a darker turn. He starts writing tragedies. He's written some before then, but they really get darker, right? The period from 1585 to 92 is variously called the lost years or the dark years. And all that's meant by that is it's like Shakespeare drops off the face of the planet. There's no reference to him. There's no records that mention him. There's nothing that he signs. See, we've got documentary evidence for this. I'm pretty sure marriage certificate, birth certificates for these 2, and then disappears. Lots of theories have been proposed for what he did, and those began, the earliest of those, began in the mid-17th century. So 50 years or so after Shakespeare's death. It was suggested that he worked for a while as a teacher, as a headmaster at a school, as a traveling actor, as a secretary to some important or powerful person. And by secretary, you don't mean person handling filing and all that kind of stuff. It's the person who would handle all the correspondence for someone who is important, the person who would do all the arrangements for travels and things like that. And the other one is that he traveled the continent. Okay? No evidence for any of these. None. We literally had no idea what Shakespeare was doing during that period. The reason each of these are given is some people have found what they think are evidence for these, but none of it's proof conclusive. Reason we think he traveled the continent is we know Shakespeare knew French. One of his sources for A Midsummer Night's Dream was only available in French, had not been translated into English. So he had to have read French. It's thought that he could probably read, if I remember correctly, some Italian and some German. Okay? He definitely knew Latin, because he's got many sources that are only available in Latin, and it's thought that he knew some Greek. All right? He probably attended the local grammar school in Stratford-on-Avon. And most scholars believe that because his father had been mayor. And kind of a perk of the job of being mayor is his kids would be able to, and he had two sons, William Shakespeare and Richard Shakespeare, that the kids would, be attendees at that school. The reason that's important is Shakespeare would have started that school at around the age of 5 or 6. It would have lasted till the ages of 12 or 13. By the second or third year, all of the instruction would have been in Latin. So like where I'm speaking English now, his teachers would all be speaking Latin. The children would begin learning Latin first day, right? So that by their second or third year, they could converse in Latin. They could, if they had something to take notes on, take notes in Latin. By the time he would have left there, his Latin, Shakespeare's Latin, would have been as good as, MTSU doesn't have one, but the University of the South, Sewanee, has a classics program where you study for 4 years Greek and Latin. Shakespeare's Latin would have been as good as a Sewanee classics graduate's Latin by the age of 12 or 13. He would have had to be able to, here's an example of what they did. He would have had to get a copy, we know this was actual practice, they'd be given a copy of something like Caesar's Gallic Wars, a paragraph of Caesar's recounting an incident. Be given an example of that, or a paragraph of that, and they had to translate that into English. So like on a piece of slate, write it out in chalk, in English. The headmaster, teacher, would then come around and look at that translation, and if it wasn't very good, rap on the knuckles with, like a stick, okay? That's the first part. The second part of the exercise is they had to take their translation without the original, translate it back into Latin. And it had to match the original. Down to the word level. Had to match. If it didn't match, rap on the knuckles and stuff, and they would do that until they got it perfectly. Okay? So Shakespeare knew Latin. He was also taught some Greek, we're pretty sure. So, he's not doing anything during this period, or we don't know what he's doing. In 1592, this date, a guy named Robert Greene, writes a pamphlet called A Groat's Worth of Wit and 1,000 of Remembrance. A groat's like a penny. So a penny's worth of wit is like a penny for your thoughts. Penny's worth of wisdom, all right? the guy who writes this, Robert Greene, he's dying. He's on his deathbed. And this is his parting shot at the world because he doesn't think the world's been fair to him. And the reason he thinks that is because there are writers like Shakespeare who are pushing him off the stage, so to speak. Young upstarts, all right? And he makes a reference to an upstart crow. This is some of this is exact language from it. An upstart crow who has beautified himself with our feathers, etc. And then he has this line where he says something to the effect of he is someone who, with a player's heart wrapped in a tiger's hide. Player's heart wrapped in a tiger's hide. Well, in one of Shakespeare's Henry VI plays, there's 3 parts to that series. He has a line there that talks about a woman's heart wrapped in a tiger's hide. So what Greene is doing there is he's alluding via that line to Shakespeare. So we know that by 1592, he's in London. We don't know when he arrives in London. It's often assumed that he's probably there by 1589 or 1590 at the latest. The Henry VI plays are usually dated to 1589 to 93 to 92. Earliest 1589, definitely by the publication of that thing in 1592. All right. In the 1590s, Shakespeare is working as a member of the, I don't remember if this is in your book, the Lord Chamberlain's men. The Lord Chamberlain is like the right-hand man to Queen Elizabeth. Very, very powerful. They're called that because the Lord Chamberlain patronizes them. He pays their bills. He supports them, right? Shakespeare is writing for this acting company, writing plays and acting in their plays at the theater where they perform them. The theater where they perform them is just called the theater, built in either 1575 or 1576 by James or Richard Burbage. I can never get the 2 straight. One is father, the other is son. I think it's James Burbage is the father, Richard is the son, but don't hold me to that. In 1575 or 76, the elder Burbage, let me put it that way, the father, constructed a building for putting on plays. He did that on some property that he did not own. He leased the property. So he constructs this big building to put on plays, and it's there from 1575 or 76 to 1599. In 1599, the lease comes due, meaning he's got 2 options. Well, 3, I guess. 1, he doesn't renew the lease, and the guy who owns the land then owns the building. If he doesn't renew the lease, he's lost ownership of the building he constructed on the guy's land. 2, he could renew the lease, okay, and he still owns the building. 3 is what Shakespeare's group, the Lord Chamberlain's men, do. They take it apart. They take the entire theater apart, and they move it about 3 miles south. When they move it 3 miles south, they reconstruct it on the south bank of the River Thames in an area called Southwark, okay? And they move it there for a very specific reason. It is outside the jurisdiction, authority, control of the Mayor of London. See, in the 1590s, the Mayor of London shut down all the playhouses because of plague. This is the kind of plague that if you're sitting in close proximity to somebody else and you cough or sneeze, you spread the plague, all right? It's a good reason to close a theater. They can't do that when they're no longer in their jurisdiction. So you have playhouses in the mid to late 1590s built on the south side of the Thames. Well, in 1599, Shakespeare's group dismantled the theater. They rebuilt it on the south side of the Thames, and it's renamed the Globe. And Shakespeare is going to refer to that globe as, he's going to call it this wooden O and other things. He's actually going to call it the Globe in one of the plays. All right. 1612, two major or important things happen. One, in a production of King Henry VIII, the globe burns to the ground. They're firing off a cannon. Cannon's filled with blanks, but the wadding shoots out, lands on the thatched roof, and it burns to the ground like within an hour. If you go to the Globe Shakespeare Theater today, about a quarter mile from where the original one was, it's built exactly the way the original one was. Same materials. I was there in 1995 when they were building part of it. The thatched roof has fireproofing within it, so even if the thatch catches fire at the top, the rest of it can't. Okay, and they've built the seats are all just wooden benches, to accommodate our bodies and not Renaissance bodies. Because in Shakespeare's day, I would have been considered tall, 5'10". Average height for a man in Shakespeare's day is about 5'6", 5'7". Okay, and they were a lot smaller width-wise than we are. They could fit a lot more people in the Globe in Shakespeare's day than you can today. Okay. The other thing, 1612, 1613, Shakespeare writes his last play on his own. It's called The Tempest, and then moves back to Stratford. He's there with his wife for 4 years, and then he dies. In 1623, Shakespeare's fellow actors in what had been the Lord Chamberlain's Men, in 1603 they become the King's Men after King James. King James patronizes them. In 1623, his fellow actors issue a collected edition of Shakespeare's plays. It's just called the First Folio. Folio just refers to the size of it. I'm trying to think of something not quite big enough, but that's close. This is about, that would be about the size, height-wise of the First Folio, and that's about the size width-wise, and the thickness is about like that. It's a big, massive book. Took a lot of money to print this thing. They were taking a bet that this would, sell, essentially. The First Folio is the first printing of something like 22 of these 37 plays. In other words, nobody else until that had access to these 22 plays by Shakespeare. The other 15 or so, there were previous printings, there were bad manuscript copies, things like that. Okay? So this is really, really important. Whenever a new one of these is discovered, if they get auctioned off, they go for millions because they're so rare. All right. That brings me in just a moment to this anti-Stratfordian thing. There are a lot of people who don't think that William Shakespeare of Stratford-on-Avon is the person who wrote the plays. They think that for a couple of reasons, which are primarily elitist. Okay? The number one reason why what are called the anti-Stratfordians don't think Shakespeare wrote the plays is because he never attended the university or a university. There's no indication, no roles, for example, that show that. Their assumption is that someone with a university education could write these things. Only someone with a university of education would have the command of rhetoric, the command of all these rhetorical styles from ancient Greece and Rome to be able to do this. And that only somebody with a university education would have this kind of in-depth understanding of human nature that the writer of the plays portrays. So notice that's why I said it's an elitist attitude. It assumes you can only be in touch with what makes people tick if you study them somehow. Via literature, philosophy, music, all those kinds of things. Okay? And there's some pretty big names in terms of the people who hold this belief. So Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of our earliest, supposedly greatest Supreme Court justices, the guy who was the artistic director, Mark Rylance, of the reconstructed Shakespeare's Globe in London for its first 10 years. He says in the very first page of a book that celebrates his 10 years as artistic director that Shakespeare wasn't Shakespeare. Okay? I think he's completely wrong. Most scholars think they're a bunch of crackpots. Most of the important claims by the anti-Stratfordians for the person they say did write the plays, they have a genealogical connection. There are people who are descendants of Francis Bacon, who say Bacon was the one who wrote them. There are people who are the descendants of Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, who say he was the author. So they're kind of puffing up themselves. There's plenty of evidence within the plays, within the poems, that show the person who wrote those was somebody who came from the county of Warwickshire. In England, I teach a course called The History of the English Language. In England, you can narrow down to where somebody came from simply by their dialect. You couldn't do that here. You couldn't tell a difference between a Williamson County person and a Rutherford County person and a Davidson County person and maybe parts of Coffee County you could, but not in England. You can do that by dialect, simply because most people in Shakespeare's day, they did not go anywhere beyond 10 miles from the place they were born in their entire lifetime. And so those dialects get reinforced, okay? Just thought I should mention that about the anti-Stratfordians. Let's see here. Before we talk about that, so Shakespeare's theater, you've got a picture of it in your book you got a kind of a cross section on page 1175 of the Globe. Okay? So you have the stage here. Stage is about 42 feet long, 24 feet deep, right? Over part of the stage, you have a ceiling or roof held up by two big pillars out in front. On the underside of that, it's painted like the sky. So you have a sun, you have a moon and stars. It's blue. You've got a trap door so that somebody can be brought down from that or can rise from the earth up through the heavens. And you've got a trap door in the stage so that people can go to hell in plays that involve people going to hell. Or you can have people, hide and come up and do things like that, right? Right immediately off the stage, so think of the stage as being up here, there's this big open area. It's just called the yard, okay? Dirt, nutshells, grass, stuff like that are on the floor or the ground of the yard. If you paid a penny to get admission to the Globe, or the theater before that, you were called a groundling. You paid admittance to stand here. Same thing applies today. If you go to Shakespeare's Globe in London, it's not a penny. I think it's like 7 or 10 pounds now. And you buy a groundling ticket, you stand somewhere in this area. And you have to stand during the entire performance. You can't sit down. If you sit down, one of the volunteers will come and pull you up. If it starts pouring, you try to open an umbrella, they'll take it from you because you can't block anybody else's view, right? So these are groundlings. The people who paid a penny to get these seats or to stand were generally poor and uneducated. That is, these are people who did not go to any kind of school. So this would be tradesmen, like some of the characters we're going to see in the play, people pouring drinks at bars, servers, waitresses, all that kind of, all right? They would bring food with them. Sometimes that food would go bad and they would just drop it on the ground and leave it. We know from anecdotal evidence, people during some of the longer plays, rather than leave and go to an outhouse, they would just drop their britches and relieve themselves right there while everyone's around them, okay? This could be dangerous, not sanitary reasons, obviously, because if the groundlings aren't kept entertained, they would just lean down and pick up whatever on the ground and throw it on the stage. Okay? So, that makes it incumbent on Shakespeare and other authors to definitely have stuff in their plays that appeals to someone who is illiterate and uneducated and probably has a somewhat cruder sense of humor and what is funny and entertaining. All right? Your book talks about the difference between low comedy and high comedy. Low comedy, slapstick, people getting punched, people getting tripped, Three Stooges. Okay? High comedy, verbal comedy, verbal wit. All right? So the people who sat up here in the gallery, that's the educated class. They paid good money to get those seats. So you have to also appeal to them. High comedy, in other words. So you use a lot of verbal devices, verbal tricks, fireworks and such like that. So Shakespeare's got this diverse group he's got to, as author, he's got to appeal to. Let me come over here. Your book talks about medieval kinds of plays, miracle plays, morality plays, etc. Know what those are, mystery plays. Those are in your book. And then when it gets to Shakespeare specifically, he talks about the three main genres that he writes in: comedies, histories, tragedies. Comedies and tragedies can begin the exact same way. It all depends on what happens at the climax. Okay? Comedies begin with some kind of rupture or tear in society. Society, either writ large, the state, or the smallest unit of society, a family. A family is torn apart, okay? At the beginning, we're going to see that with A Midsummer Night's Dream. Within 50 lines of the opening, what do we hear? What is the problem? Character Aegeus comes in, he says, I want my daughter to marry Demetrius, she wants to marry Lysander. There's the rupture. She doesn't want to do what her father tells her to do, okay? So, you start with that rupture. And as the play goes on, as you get the complication, the exposition, that rupture seemingly gets bigger or greater. And maybe it ripples out to other aspects of society. So you have all of society in danger of falling apart. In the climax, however, in a comedy, rather than having an unraveling, and as we get in tragedy, as we saw with tragedy, the reversal of the tragic character where, everything's been going great for them, and he recognizes his or her fault, and everything reverses and falls apart, and the tragic hero dies or ends up, in great pain. In a comedy, where that climax occurs, that's where the healing starts. So that by the end of a comedy, you have society restored. The family is no longer broken. Okay? If it's a romantic comedy, the lovers come together, both metaphorically and literally. All right? Tragedy, obviously, is very, very different. This play that we're going to talk about, Midsummer Night's Dream, could very easily become a tragedy. The opening scene indicates that. Because what are we told are the options the young woman, Hermia, is given? You can marry the man your father wants you to marry. You can become a nun to the goddess of chastity and virginity for your entire life and never have any kind of contact with men, or you can die. See, those other two options, those are pretty bad. Those are not healing solutions, okay? So think of comedy as kind of the flip of that pyramid that I drew for tragedy earlier. Histories. Histories aren't, they deal with historical characters and events. They are not history, though. You can't read Shakespeare's history plays, which are about English history. They're about English monarchs, and think that it teaches you English history. And here's why. Shakespeare plays fast and loose with dates, events, and characters. That is, things that in some of his histories take place over 20 years, he condenses to 2 months. Characters that historically are 20 years older, in Shakespeare, he makes them the same age. So for my Shakespeare course, we're starting Henry IV, Part 1. In that play, you have a character, the Prince of Wales, who's about 20 years old. You have another character named Hotspur, who also in the play is about 20 years old. In reality, the guy who was named Hotspur was the age of Prince Harry's father. Shakespeare, however, wants to make them the same age so he can have them play off of each other, okay? Tragedies are like the Greek and Roman tragedies that we talked about. Bear in mind, with Shakespeare, those, as we talked about before, those three unities of Aristotle's, time, place, and action, out the door. Just totally gone. We're going to see when we open up Midsummer Night's Dream, 2 settings. Come on, Orm. You have Athens and a wood outside Athens. Athens represents reason, law, morality, order, and the wood represents the opposite. Unreason, chaos, anarchy, immorality, in a sense. Okay? One last thing, I think. Yes. I have to discuss this before we get into the play. The Elizabethans had a view of the world that goes back far beyond them and that continued on after them for a while, that essentially said, I might have talked about this a little bit before, but I don't think so, that essentially said everything that is created is connected to each other. Like this chain. You've got links. And so everything that's created is a link on a great chain. It gets called in the later 17th century, it gets called the great chain of being. Everything that exists is connected, all right? Within that, so for example, at the top of that chain, you have the angelic realm. Okay? God's not part of the chain. Why? Because God creates everything. He's totally different, totally other, totally outside all of that. But everything God creates is all on that chain. So, according to this belief system, the highest order of creation is the angelic order. And just like all of creation exists on this chain, within each link of the chain, you have smaller links. And there's this hierarchy within those. So within the angelic realm, go back to scripture, go back to some of the early church fathers, you have these 9 orders of angelic beings. The very lowest order, the common, ordinary, garden variety angelic being is just angel. Angel simply means messenger, mail carrier, if you want, you know. The highest of those, cherubim and seraphim, the ones constantly in the presence of God. So go down to the human realm. What's the hierarchy? We don't have it as much in the United States. Well, we say we don't. Who's at the top in the United States? President. Who's at the bottom? The poorest person you could think of, I guess. Somebody living under a bridge somewhere, something like that. And in between that, you've got the lower class, the lower class, the low class, the low middle class, all the way up to the next in line to the president, so to speak. Okay, but bear in mind, it's not quite appropriate because president's political, not, if you think in England, the king or queen, because king and queen aren't political. They are, but they're also social. They are the top of the social hierarchy, okay? Down to the lowest person tied to the land. Animals. What's king of beasts? What animal has a name to it, not the name of the animal, but like a human name that's often given to it? That means king. The lion, Leo, okay? King of the birds, eagles, ocean, gray whale, blue whale, trees, redwood, everything has its hierarchy. Plants, rocks, down to modern quantum physics, the lowest particle of existence. This all exists connected. But if we were to take that chain out and shake it like this, notice the top wouldn't move much, but the bottom is going to move wildly, right? So what happens if you break a link? Whoosh. So in that great chain of being, if there's a problem at some point, then the things beneath that get affected by that break. We're going to be introduced in the first act to non-human characters. The fairies. Where are they on the great chain of being? Well, the way I've put them, they're higher than us. Why? Because they have powers that we don't have. We're going to be told Puck can go around the world in 45 minutes. We can't do that. We're going to be told they can make themselves invisible. We can't do that. They can control the weather. We think we can't do that, okay? And then we're going to see a character who becomes kind of subhuman. He gets an ass's head put on his head, or he gets his head turned into the head of a donkey. So he's got the body of a man, the head of a donkey. What's happened to him? He's gone this way. Not quite fully human, not quite fully animal, all right? And what we're going to see is that the turmoil in this play is caused because of turmoil in the fairy realm. The king and queen of fairies aren't sleeping together. There's a problem in the marriage, and that has repercussions all throughout everything from that level down. All right? We're going to see a very similar thing, without fairies though, when we get to Hamlet. There's all kinds of problems in Hamlet because of what happened at the top of the human level. Okay? So, Athens would. All right. Now we can start talking about the play. So, if you have your books, open your books, 1181 and following. Go through the dramatis personae. So you have Theseus, Duke of Athens. Hippolyta, Queen of the Amazons, betrothed to Theseus. Philostrate, or Philostrate, however you want to pronounce his name, master of the revels, Aegeus, father of Hermia. We'll stop there for a moment. Theseus, Duke of Athens. Theseus is one of those characters from Greek mythology. He's a hero, he's a warrior, he's the one who figured out how to get out of the labyrinth. He's the one who killed the Minotaur that was at the center of the labyrinth. A Minotaur, part human, part ox, bull, okay? So, famous character of Greek mythology, like Tiresias level, all right? Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. What can you tell me about Amazons? What do we know about Amazons? They're all women. Before you get strong, they are strong. How do you get all women from only women? There are men in the Amazon society. Gender roles have been swapped. They would say not swapped in the proper perspective according to Amazons. So what role do men serve in the Amazon society? There are only two. One, to impregnate the women, keep the society going. And two, they're slaves. They're sex slaves. Okay? Used sexually for procreation. I was going to say recreation, but more the other one. And farm the fields, do the cooking, do the cleaning, all the serving. Okay? What else do we know about Amazons? Someone said strong. Why? What was their thing? What was their gift? What did they do? They were warriors. How serious were they about their being warriors? How serious do you have to be to become a Navy SEAL? You got to be damn serious. You got to do some stupid, crazy stuff in order to become a Navy SEAL. I mean, the physical testing. Amazons were no different. Here's how serious they were. Their weapon of choice was bow and arrow, archery. Okay? I don't know if any of you have ever done any archery. You don't stand like this and hold the bow like this. You turn to the side, hold the bow like that, like that. If you're a man, there's not any problem with that. If you're a woman, depending on how well endowed you are, there could be a huge problem. So right-handed Amazonians would lop off their left breast so that when they let go of that string, it wouldn't hit. And if they were left-handed, they'd lop off the right breast. I don't know many Navy's. I've known a couple of Navy SEALs who would be willing to lop off part of their bodies in order to make them better, okay, at that particular task. So, she's queen of the Amazons. That doesn't just mean, she's the political leader. It also means she's the toughest, baddest warrior princess, so to speak, there is, okay? We're going to find out why she's marrying Theseus in a moment. Then you have the four lovers mentioned. All right? Hermia, daughter of Aegeus, in love with Lysander. Cool. Lysander in love with Hermia. No problem there, right? She loves him, he loves her. Everything's fine. Demetrius, in love with Hermia. See, there's the wrinkle. And favored by Aegeus, Hermia's father. Helena in love with Demetrius. So two lovers are perfectly matched. And then there's a third guy wanting to horn in on the first guy's, lover. And then there's a second girl wanting the second guy, okay? Then we get the fairies mentioned. Oberon, king of the fairies, Titania, queen of the fairies, and Puck or Robin Goodfellow. Shakespeare does not invent the character of Puck. This character goes back thousands of years. This character, this kind of being, let me put it that way, shows up in Slavic languages and literatures like Russian and Ukrainian and Belarusian. Shows up in the Indian languages and literatures, that is the subcontinent of India, like Hindu literature, Bengali literature, that kind of stuff. He shows up in Italic, in Greek, English, Nordic, okay? And he's related, in that sense, to the character like of Loki, trickster. Might be where the idea of poltergeists come from. The things that, you leave your keys one place And you know exactly where you left them, and you come back an hour later, and they're not there. Okay? Wants to play games with us. And we get that talked about briefly in the play. Okay? And then a bunch of other little fairies. Shakespeare, by the way, is the first author in English literature to portray fairies as being so small you could fit them in this lid. Prior to Shakespeare, all the fairies / elves were like us, big. That's why in various Middle English stories, fairies would come to capture humans and take them off to the other world to usually use them as sex slaves. Okay? And then on the next page, 1182, you got a group of characters who are variously called the rustics or rude mechanicals, or, and this is the one I like the least, clowns. They're not clowns, because we have a notion of clown that just doesn't fit. These guys do not have the funny noses, the big floppy shoes, the wild hair and stuff. Rustics means uneducated, common, ordinary. Rude mechanicals, the rude part doesn't mean they lack manners. It means they're not educated. They haven't been to university. And they're mechanicals in that they work with their hands. Term we would use for them today, skilled tradesmen. Look at their jobs. Peter Quince, a carpenter. Is a carpenter someone a good carpenter? Is a good carpenter stupid? Hell no. If that person cannot measure wood, you're not going to have anything worth buying. Okay? Nick Bottom, a weaver. Someone who could take a whole bunch of thread and turn it into fabric. Again, skilled, not necessarily knowledgeable about world book learning. Okay? Francis Flute, a bellows mender. You need a bellows in order to have a blacksmith shop. Tom Snout, a tinker. A tinker is one who kind of does jack of all trades. He builds things, he makes things, he takes things apart, etc. Snug, a joiner. That's a particular kind of carpenter. That's a carpenter who makes chairs and tables and desks and dressers and windows and doors. Robin Starveling, a tailor, takes that woven cloth, makes it into clothing. Okay? And then you have a bunch of lords and ladies. And notice these rustics, they're going to play other characters within the play. Because this is one of the plays where Shakespeare has a play within the play. All right? So, it opens, 1182. Two scenes. There's Athens and a wood near it. When Act 1, Scene 1 opens, we're at Theseus' court in Athens. And Theseus comes in with Hippolyta, Philostrates, and others. Others are just other, attending lords and such. And Theseus tells us quickly what's going to happen. Now, fair Hippolyta, our nuptial hour draws on apace. 4 happy days bring in another moon, but oh, methinks how slow this old moon wanes. In other words, in 4 days, what? They're getting married. And he says that hour, the hour of their marriage, draws on, what does apace mean? It's slowly, one step at a time. And he says those 4 days will bring in another moon, that is a new moon. But oh, methinks how slow this old moon wanes. Why does he think the moon is taking a long time to wane for the new moon to come? What's he expressing here? What's he want to happen quickly? He wants to get married quickly. And instead, what's happening? Are any of you graduating this semester? Usually I've got someone in every one of these classes. The second class, I don't. Well, doesn't have to be that, but Usually in your last semester, you're gonna get the fidgets, man. You just want to be done. Most of you want to be done now. I mean, you want to be done with this class now. Just get it over with, Give me my grade. That's what he's thinking. Come on, let's just do it now. It's taking too long, okay? Hippolyta says, 4 days will quickly steep themselves in night, 4 nights will quickly dream away the time. And then the moon, like to a silver bow, new bent in heaven, shall behold the night of our solemnities. What is she saying about the passage of time? Because his comments are all about time is going too slow. She says, no, it's not. The time's going to fly by. Shakespeare didn't know this, all right? But what is he talking about here? Physicist, early 20th century, came up with the notion time is relative. Einstein, theory of relativity. It's relative depending upon what? First day of class, I talked about this part of it. Our perspectives. If there's something you're really, really, really looking forward to it slows down. If there's something you're really, really, really enjoying, it goes by too quickly. And believe me, I'm 62. The older you get, it's like the faster, in one sense, the faster time goes. Why? There's death, and it's like, I'm this much closer to it. You guys are back there still. It speeds up in that sense, which is why when you're younger and you're way back here, it's like, got all the time in the world. And you wake up one morning and you realize, damn, I don't have all the time in the world anymore, okay? So, 2 things about her speech. She says the days will quickly steep themselves in night. We only use that verb steep for one purpose anymore. Anybody know how it's used? It's a drink. Tea. Tea. You steep tea. You put your tea leaves in a cup and you pour, I don't know how well you can see that, this hot on them. Notice, what color, so to speak, is that water? It's clear. It's not a color, right? What happens when you pour it onto tea leaves? It turns dark. These, she says, 4 days will quickly steep themselves in night. In other words, night is going to quickly overcome these 4 days. She's saying, Theseus, chill out. Before you know it, those days are going to be gone. And it's going to be the night of our wedding. Okay? So Theseus tells Philostrate, go stir up the Athenian youth. Have people plan a party. All kinds of stuff. Bouncy house, jugglers, not throwers, swallowers, all that kind of stuff. Okay? In comes Aegeus. So notice, just the opening part, it starts with joy. There's going to be a great thing to come. Then Aegeus comes in. And Theseus says, what's the news? What's up? How are you doing? Full of vexation come I. Vexation doesn't mean, I've got a mental problem and I haven't figured it out. Vexation means anger. Why? He's got a complaint against his child, his daughter Hermia. And it's like he's holding her by the hand, pulls her up. And he says, stand forth, Demetrius. And he says, this man has my consent to marry her. Okay? This is ancient Greece. It's not 2024 America. What does that mean, ancient Greece? She is his to do with what he wants. Period. No discussion. That was part of the radical thing about Antigone. She was challenging Creon, and she was ancient Greece, mere woman. which he understood, which is why he said, I will not be the man if I let her win. Okay? So, he has my consent to marry her. Should be done. Shouldn't be any discussion. And then he says, Lysander, stand forth. He makes Lysander stand forth. He says, but this man has done what to my daughter? He hath bewitched the bosom of my child. Bewitched. He's put a spell on her bosom. He's not talking about her breasts. He's talking about what's inside. He's stolen her heart. And interchanged love tokens with her in rhymes. He's sung to her by moonlight. Okay? With cunning, line 36, he says, hast thou filched my daughter's heart. In the Harry Potter novels, J.K. Rowling names the caretaker of the castle, Argus Filch. You know why she names him Filch? We see it come out in a couple of the books. He steals from students. Filch means to steal, to take. He's saying he stole her heart. So he says, he has turned her obedience, which is due to me, to stubborn harshness. She should obey me. I should be everything to her. Ancient Greece, and to some extent, even in Elizabethan England. Women, however, in Elizabethan England, women did have some rights. Women could own property. Women could inherit property. Couldn't become members of parliament. Couldn't vote. Okay. So, he says, so she doesn't want to marry Demetrius. Here's what I want from you, Duke. One, make her marry him, or what's the second option? The Athenian law. And the Athenian law says what? I beg the ancient privilege of Athens. As she is mine, I may dispose of her. As she is mine, which shall be either to this gentleman. The word dispose literally means give away. So I shall give her away either to this gentleman or death. She either marries who I want her to marry or she dies. There's your rupture. There's your conflict. And this is said right after what's been talked about. The future upcoming wedding of Theseus and Hippolyta. And I skipped. Let me go back for just a moment. Line 16 and 17. After Hippolyta says her lines, after Theseus sends Philostrate to stir up the Athenian youth, he says, Hippolyta, I wooed thee with my sword, and won thy love doing thee injuries. How did he woo her? How did he court her? How did he win her hand in marriage? He beat her in battle. And to beat her in battle in both senses. He defeated her and he beat her, doing the injuries. She was injured in battle. That's the literal meaning. Metaphorical meaning may just be he injured her pride because she's an Amazonian queen and he, a mere man, defeated her. But he says, I will wed thee in another key. In other words, I'm not going to hold the sword to your throat. She's a spoil of war. Okay? So Aegeus comes in, talks about this. She either marries him or she dies. Theseus, Hermia, what do you say? That in and of itself is an anachronism. That is, Ancient Greece, that wouldn't happen. But Shakespeare's also writing for his audience. Because you have to imagine, here, probably 40 to 50% of those people standing or sitting watching this play are women. And 1598 women are really all not that much different from 2024 women. They don't want to hear about some poor woman not getting a fair shake. So, he says, to you your father should be as a god. Why? One that composed your beauties, yea, and one to whom you are but as a form in wax. Well, part of this is medieval and Renaissance ideas about, the generation of the race, of humanity, propagation and such, that the male imprints the image of his children on the mother. And she's merely kind of a producer of that. She's like the oven, but the children are the dough, so to speak. Okay? It's weird, I know. So he says, you're nothing but clay to your father's hands. He made you. Bill Cosby used to, back when Bill Cosby was still liked, Bill Cosby, my dad used to play Bill Cosby comedy albums when I was growing up, back in the 60s. And he had this one where he talks about his father when he was a young child. Talks about his father, would get angry at the kids. Kids would do something bad. And his father would say, son, I brought you into this world. I can take you out of it. His father was very stern. Okay? That's what Theseus is saying. And he finishes. Demetrius is a worthy gentleman. Like, come on, what's wrong with Demetrius? And she says, so is Lysander. Notice Theseus's response. You're right. In himself he is. He's saying Lysander and Demetrius are equals, with one exception. Demetrius has your father's voice. Therefore, he must be held the worthier. I would my father look but with my eyes. What does she mean? See, this is probably meant at least partially humorous and maybe dangerously humorous. What does she mean? I wished my father, that's what would means, looked with my eyes. Looked at what with her eyes? You're smirking. Looked at Lysander. How does she look at Lysander? She wants to marry Lysander. She wished her father looked at Lysander the way she does. See, the audience down here, they're probably going, you kidding? If he, her father, looks at Lysander with the eyes of Hermia, that implies wanting to marry him. Why? To have sex with him. So there's a homoerotic vibe possibly going on, which the groundlings down here, they'd be hooting and hollering at the dirty implications of that in their day. Those up here would probably be going, how dare he? I mean, issues of morality and the church is against this. Buggering is, buggering, an English term for homosexual sex, is not allowed, etc. Okay? Theseus, he understood what he said, what Hermia said. Rather, your eyes must with his judgment look. See, she's looking with the eyes of desire. He's saying, no. You've got to look with the eyes of wisdom, rationality, the way your father does. Are we told any reason ever in the play why Aegeus favors Demetrius over Lysander? We're not. In fact, we're going to be told that for all intents and purposes, they are equal. Lysander's actually going to say, actually, I've got a step up on Demetrius. Okay? So, Hermia says, Your Grace, I don't know what makes me so bold, but you got to tell me, what's the worst that can happen to me? If I don't marry Demetrius, what's going to happen? He says, so if you don't marry him, so that's the first option. You can marry him. If you don't take that option, to die the death or to abjure forever the society of men. Notice he's thrown in another option. Aegeus said, marry Demetrius or die. Theseus says, marry Demetrius or die, or become a nun to the goddess of virginity and chastity. Notice what he says about that. Therefore, fair Hermia, question your desires. He doesn't mean simply rational intellectual desires. Question your bodily desires. And how do we know that's what he means? Know of your youth. Examine well your blood. She's young, probably a teenager. Hormones flowing. Can you really give up the It's clear she's a virgin at this point. The possibility of sex forever. Whether if you yield not to your father's choice, you can endure the livery, that is the clothing, of a nun. I, to be in shady cloister mewed, that is, walled up. To never be let out of this convent, so to speak. To live a barren sister all your life. And he goes on and says, hey man, thrice blessed are they who can live that kind of life. Why? Because St. Paul says that, essentially. Paul says if you can live unmarried and not burn with lust, you're better off for that. But most can't, so they should get married. Okay? He says if you don't get married, you will die like the rose distilled that grows, lives, and dies in single blessedness. In other words, a rose that doesn't unite ideas with another rose does what? Dies as a single bloom on a stem. It doesn't make more beautiful roses. He's kind of implying, Hermia, you're kind of hot. Demetrius is not so bad looking. You guys could have beautiful children. She says, so will I grow, so live, so die my Lord. Ere before I will yield my virgin patent up. Her virgin right, her mark of virginity to him. In other words, enforced marriage, which is just fancy language for what? Forced rape. That's it. I'm not going to endure this forced rape with a man I don't love. And he goes, no, you don't have to answer now. Take some time. Tell you what, see, we're getting married in 4 days. You could tell us then. Is that a smart move on Theseus' part? Do you want to be announced to the town? This poor girl has got to die, but we're getting married. Yay. And who's he getting married to? Queen of the Amazons. If there's going to be any defender of women around, who is that going to be? Queen of the Amazons. What kind of marriage bed do you think he's going to have that night? Probably not much, okay? She says, no. 4 days till our sealing day. And then Demetrius says, relent, sweet Hermia. Give it up. In many senses of that phrase. In Lysander, yield thy crazed title to my certain right. Crazed, you've got a gloss down at the bottom. Cracked, unsound. That could be. I think he means crazed in the sense that you have made her crazy for you. Crazy in love. Release that title back to me, that her father is given. Look at Lysander's response. As his girlfriend started, he kind of follows. You have her father's love, Demetrius. Let me have Hermia's. What's that implying? You and Lysander go off behind the bushes and let me and Hermia go off behind. Again, think audience. Okay? The poorly educated, the crude, the rude are eating that kind of language up. Okay? Probably those in the gallery are also going, well, that's pretty witty, yeah, but that's pretty smart. So it's both low and high. It's not low in the sense of slapstick, bodily, physical humor, but in terms of its mental essence, its symbolism. You marry him, Aegeus, scornful, like Aegeus doesn't like what he's getting at. How dare you? He says he has my love, and what is mine I can give. And I give it all to Demetrius. And that's where Lysander stands up for his rights. Well, what he thinks of his rights. He says, my lord, I am as well derived as he. That is, I come from as good a family as Demetrius. Look at our family history, our family names. We go as far back. What else? I am as well possessed. I'm loaded like he is. My love is more than his. What does he mean my love is more? I really love Hermia. My fortunes everywhere is fairly ranked. That is, I'm good at business, and fortune smiles at me, if not with vantage, if I'm not actually a little bit better off than Demetrius. And more than all this, and here's his ace that he pulls out of his sleeve. More than this, I am beloved of her. She loves me. And he says, and I'll swear it to his head. I'll avouch it to his head means I'll fight him. Challenge him to a duel. So, Hermia loves me, that's a 1+ on Lysander's side, he's suggesting. And then what does he do? And then he does, think politicals, think politics and politicians. And then he goes for the negative ad. So he's been talking about all his positives. Now the negative ad. I'll swear it to his head, Demetrius made love to Nadar's daughter, Helena. Made love doesn't mean he had sex. It means he wooed her just like Lysander did Hermia. He sang songs, he wrote love poems, he sent flowers and gifts. So that's why Helena is in love with Demetrius. He won her heart first, and then what? And then he turned to Hermia. So what's he telling Aegeus and the audience? Demetrius is false. He won't be true to your daughter. Okay? And that's when Theseus says, I heard that. I've heard stories about that, and I meant to talk to Demetrius about that. Okay? So, he gets ready to leave. And Theseus says, Hermia, 4 days. 4 days you have to decide. Line 120. Or else the law of Athens yields you up, which by no means we may extenuate. That is, we can't bend the law to death or to a vow of single life. So those are your options. Come, my Hippolyta, what cheer, my love? Come, my Hippolyta, what is the, and we're going to stop with this, what does the what cheer, my love mean? Cheer refers to your face, how you appear. It doesn't mean cheery, okay? The what cheer kind of implied she's done something with her face. What? She doesn't have a happy look on her face. You're going to die or become a nun to virginity. Come on, Hippolyta. What's wrong? That's what cheer means. Why? Is Shakespeare giving us a subtle verbal stage direction there as to what Hippolyta should be doing? Because I kind of imagine, if I were directing this, Hippolyta has gone from standing there, being loving looking, to standing there, putting her hands on her hips like, what the hell, man? You're going to make this poor girl either give up her virginity or become a nun or die. This is not why Amazons live. It's almost like she's taking a stance, okay? And we get that part ends. We're going to pick up with about line 128 or so on whatever day, Thursday. And we'll hopefully get through 1 and 2, the rest of 1 and all of 2 Thursday, if not 3. I won't put up a quiz yet. Yeah, I will, because the quiz does not give. No, I won't. I'll put up a quiz after Thursday. All right, that's all.